Start today with Dr. Jordan Peterson. Nothing like piggybacking off another man's fame. But I actually have some things that I want to observe about him that I trust will be helpful. But for those of you who have not heard very much about Dr. Peterson, he is a lecturer, he is a psychologist, specifically he's the professor of psychology at the University of Toronto in Canada. And he shot to fame a few years ago when he refused a university edict that staff refer to students by their preferred gender pronouns. He said that he would not be compelled concerning what he must say, especially by those who are driven by Marxist motives. And of course he has been an outspoken critic of one of the ideas that is swirling around in our Western society at the moment called cultural Marxism. But he has become a global phenomenon since then. In fact, he's lectured in over 100 cities to more than 250,000 people in the last 12 months since he launched 12 Rules for Life. His recent tour of Australia and New Zealand has so far attracted 43,000 people, which is pretty big. But actually, as I wrote that stat down, it occurred to me that a man who has not had the same prominence in mainstream circles is Franklin Graham, and he recently did a tour just of Australia, not New Zealand, and he attracted roughly 60,000 people, and he actually went to fewer cities than Jordan Peterson. For example, he never went to Canberra. But that to one side, we have the phenomenon known as Jordan Peterson, which is a global phenomenon, and he is particularly well known, well received amongst younger people, especially amongst younger men. And you know, his stated purpose, and he said this recently, is a message of meaning, which of course rubs up against the meaninglessness of the kind of worldview into which so many in their 20s and 30s have been inducted, the postmodern or postmodern-ish worldview of the modern West. But you know, I've been to one of his lectures in Sydney, and I would say also a quest for truth. He looks for truth, and he looks to build up meaning. He tears down that house of cards, which is a postmodern worldview, and he seeks to rebuild something substantial with a stronger foundation in its place. And there's been much conjecture about Dr. Peterson's view of Christianity and his view of God. Of course, he actually lectures the Bible in some of his lectures that he posts online, and he is well liked by many Christians because he is sympathetic towards so many Christian principles. And you know, the question of God actually came up in his appearance on ABC's Q&A on Monday night. He was invited on as one of the panelists, and of course ABC, as a result, saw their highest ratings so far this year, which is completely unsurprising. But you know, one of the questions asked the panel if they believe in God, and I thought the answers were very interesting. All of the panelists made a concession to some degree of the reality of God. Catherine McGregor answered first, and Catherine McGregor is a transgender person born a man. And Catherine said, "I do believe, and I base that on experience. There was what I can only describe as a phenomenon in response to a very desperate prayer when I was dying in delirium tremens, and I've not had a drink since the day I uttered that prayer." That's of course withdrawal from alcoholism, from alcohol as an alcoholic. "I've been welcome in some Anglican communities, and I go there because I like the ritual. But without beating my breast in the public square, I pray daily. I pray in the morning upon waking. I pray at intervals throughout the day, and I try to meditate." That from Catherine McGregor. Van Badham, who was also on the panel, said, "I'm a Christian, very devout, and a Marxist. Yes, both at the same time. Anyway, I absolutely believe in God, and my faith sustains me through darkness. My faith gives me meaning," is what Van Badham said. Alex Hawke, who is the Special Minister of State, the federal member for Mitchell, said, "I believe in God. I am a Protestant by tradition," and then went on to say, "One of the great successes of the West was that we separated the church and the state, and religion is a private matter." Okay. I'm not sure that's the meaning of separation of church and state. But anyway, Terry Butler, federal member for Griffith, Kevin Rudd's former seat, says, "I'm an agnostic. I've always been agnostic. I've always identified that way." And Terry Butler went on to say, well, you don't have to be a Christian to believe in human dignity and human worth and morals and so on. You don't have to believe in God, actually, is what she said. I dispute that, but there you go. And then Dr. Jordan Peterson answered last, and he gave a very oblique and sort of not clear answer at all. But this is one of the things that he said in his answer. He said, "I act as if God exists and that I'm terrified he might. I act in the manner of a person who is obsessed with religious matters. It's interesting, I was looking on social media and things like that, and a lot of people were really thrilled that the entire panel made some concession as to the existence of God. And I do think that there's something in it insofar as it represents potentially a new era in Western culture. There was a time in which such admissions you would have thought wouldn't have been so welcome in a crowd like the ABC Q&A crowd, but they in fact were not unwelcoming. In fact, I'd say somewhat in the opposite direction of these declarations. But there's a sobering verse, James chapter 2, verse 19, which says this. It says, "You believe that there is one God? Good. Even the demons believe that and tremble." You see, the better question is not whether or not I believe in God or whether or not a person believes in God. The better question is, who is God? It's the question asked that Jesus asked of Simon Peter, who said, "Who do you say that I am?" And that question, either of those questions, who is Jesus Christ? Who is God? That would have actually got a very different and an extremely revealing answer from each of the panelists on Monday night. Because you see, belief in God may be coming back in vogue. The audience certainly welcomed the response, but the God that is increasingly worshipped today is not God as you and I instinctively think about him necessarily. I think, he has a name. It's a name that I hear in conversations. It's a name that I hear in debates. It's a name that I hear as I talk to people about Christianity and God and things like that. And you've probably heard his name too. And his name is something like this. It is God to me. That's what people say. They say, God to me is like this, or does that, or is this kind of being, or is that kind of being, or comes to me in this experience, or whatever. Our views of God are so often framed entirely in terms of what we find helpful, what we find comforting, what we find reasonable, what we find to be in accordance with what we think and feel, whether God's private, not public. As one of the panelists said, whether God is not so much Lord of your life that he pushes the Marxism out of your worldview, or God who fits in with my experience, the things that I think that I've encountered. God always in a box, in my box, always God to me. And Jesus said something chilling. This is a hard business, by the way, but I think really important to ask these questions these days. Jesus said something very chilling in Matthew chapter 7 during the Sermon on the Mount. He actually said, many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. See, this is the point. He says many people are going to say, because there is a day coming when we'll see him. Many people are going to say, Lord, I know you. And the response is going to be, well, no, you don't. Doubtless you know something. Doubtless you may even know someone. But the something that you know, the someone that you know, even if very real to you, actually wasn't me. Who do you say that I am? That's the key question. Who is Jesus? Who is God? That's the question that we all have to answer, and that we will all answer one day. And it's a challenge to me, because I'm reminded that we must be scrupulous about always submitting to the truth that is revealed to us, not falling into the trap of designing something else, a Christ who is actually the Christ that I've imagined, God who is actually the God who I have imagined, stepping outside of the scope of the revelation that God has given us of himself. It requires serious and sober reflection. And that's the question that it's much harder to get Dr. Jordan Peterson to answer. Who is Jesus? Who is God really? Deep in his philosophies, deep in his thinking, there are oblique answers to those questions, but they're not necessarily the one that Peter gave. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Well, they're definitely not the one that Peter gave. But before I move on from this subject, I want to turn back more generally to Dr. Jordan Peterson, because some have asked me for my views on him. And that's a tough question, because I mean, I've got to be realistic. He's infinitely more brilliant than I am, infinitely more experienced, more thoroughly knowledgeable. It's a stupid idea to even make any sense of comparison at all. But here's what I can figure out in simple terms, which is how I try and assess things. I do try and get to the core of issues and think them through. And I've listened very hard to what he says, and I've read some of his materials. And, I have found that I've learned so much from him on a particular point. I've learned so much from him on his cultural analysis. I really have. In terms of his understanding, dissecting, describing the prevailing worldview in Western society right now. He's actually able to tell, especially millennials, younger people, about the world that they live in and the world that they're encountering in such a way that makes them go, oh my goodness, yes, that is absolutely right. This guy understands, this guy gets me, like people like him don't usually understand the world that I'm in. He's brilliant at that. I've learned a lot from him on worldview analysis, on philosophical analysis, the thought patterns of our time. But the question is, for me, his analysis is great, I've learned a lot, but what of his gospel? Because that's what he does. He analyzes the worldview. He kind of shows how empty it is, actually, the prevailing worldview that's emerging amongst millennials in our time. But what's his gospel? What's his solution? What's the truth that he wants to build up in its place? And I attended one of his lectures in Sydney. In fact, it was on his last tour when he came out here last year. And he opened by declaring quite openly that his was a quest for truth. He was searching for the truth. He said, I want to find bedrock. I want to drill all the way through till I hit rock bottom and find substance, something to stand on, something to rely on, a truth quest. And then he opened with that, and then he lectured for 2 hours. And the room hung on his every word. I looked around me at a few junctures and people were leaning forward, listening, absolutely hanging on what he was saying. And that was incredible. And it's testament, I think, to how hollowed out we have become through vacuous postmodernist type thinking that says that there is no substantial truth. To make a claim that you know truth is arrogant. It's not about telling people truth. It's about finding out what they feel about things and getting their responses on things. That's what education has done these days, and that's where it's headed. Or telling people that they can be anything they want to be and whomever they want to be, and there's no strictures or right and wrong. And we're seeing the pretty toxic fruits of that at the moment. And I looked around, and in the first tour, and I don't think that was so much the case this time, but in the first tour, most of the people were men, sort of guys in their 30s, 20s. And I looked around and I thought, yeah, here's a generation that's been sort of raised on a diet of binge watching Netflix and surfing YouTube and pornography and all of these things that are just vacuous and dissipation. And here are guys, and I talked to some of them that were sitting around me in their early 30s, realizing how that they've got a meaningless life. Many of them say to Dr. Peterson, you saved my life, you gave me meaning. And that's exactly what these guys were saying. Oh, Dr. Peterson has helped me to find meaning in life. It's incredible to see the emptiness of that which this worldview is leaving young people. And to see someone like Dr. Peterson say, well, I'm going to try and find the truth. And my goodness, don't they flock to him. But after I went to his talk, I wrote a blog, which in my hotel, and I put it up on the internet last year, and it was republished in an edited form yesterday in response to his Q&A appearance. So look at it at ACL website when you get a chance. So I'm going to read part of it, which captures my, I think, general reflection. It says, listening carefully to Peterson, I couldn't help thinking of the Apostle Paul's sermon to the Athenians on Mars Hill in Acts 17. Because they too, those Athenian philosophers, sought bedrock. They were the great Greek philosophers, the men who Paul addressed. These were engaged in one of the greatest quests for truth and ultimate meaning. Our Western cultural heritage bears witness to their work even today. But they hadn't gone deep enough. Theirs was a drilling expedition that had stopped too soon. Remember, Peterson opened with saying, I'm looking for that bedrock to drill down to. Paul saw as he walked through their city, idols and altars to many gods. So many of these represented realities that these people had discovered. Gods, for example, who imparted art and music, fertility, victory in battle, gods of the sea, of fire, of beauty, and so forth. But surely there is something even greater. that lies yet behind all of those things. And actually the history of Greek thought, I think I'm right in saying, shows that they were looking for those things that lay behind all of that. Peterson's similar. The foundations upon which he relies are the archetypes of psychological theory. They're said to be deep, enduring truths held in the collective unconscious of societies throughout the ages. They find expression in narratives and religions and social norms and psychological realities and this kind of thing. They exist and have always existed because they are true, though we often know not how or why. In his lectures, the Bible is held up as a text in which we find the paramount expression of some of these archetypes. Jesus, for example, says Peterson, shows us this deep truth, this archetypal truth, that if we bear the burden of our own vulnerability to hardship and injustice willingly and without complaint, then we will be able to transcend it. Zion, the heavenly city on a hill, tells us this truth, that we can struggle under the weighty burdens of our human brokenness in a way that carries us upwards until we reach a place where there will be no more. Or the Sermon on the Mount. It bears witness to this truth, that no matter the pain and difficulty of our own circumstances, no matter our lack of privilege, moral character is attainable by all. That's why he calls the Bible both myth and true. It's a myth that bears witness to the truths of the archetypes. But surely there is something greater than the archetypes. The realities of our world are not true because they spring from Greek myth or even from archetypes that may be expressed by those myths and other sources like the Bible. As Paul once said, these things are true because of God, who is yet unknown to Peterson and so many of his disciples, the true and living God, as Paul said at Mars Hill, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth. God who made the bedrock truth which lies behind the archetypes, the one in whom we live and move and have our being, said Paul as well, by whom we can actually become transformed to the people of character that Peterson would have his followers become. Who gives us the indwelling power to do that? In many ways, I felt like I was sitting in a modern-day Areopagus, which is where the sermon was delivered. Whilst listening to Peterson, the great philosopher stood before us, leading us on our quest for truth and meaning. An audience made hungry by hollowed-out postmodern secularism hangs on every word. Questions follow. It would have been fitting had there been an altar to an unknown God in the corner, as there was in Athens. The room doesn't know it, but he is the answer to all of their questions, those they've asked and those that they don't even know. He is the bedrock that they seek, the Logos by whom all things have been made, who is the light and life of men. There is a hungry, needy, confused generation growing up in Australia. The Dr. Jordan Petersons of this world are feeding them something, but I can't help thinking, why not the church? If it is a message of truth and meaning that we crave, then increasingly this unknown God, but revealed in the pages of Scripture, is the answer, because he is true and he has given all things their meaning.